So Mshai, karibu.
Asante sana ndugu kamata. Nimeshukuru sana kwa nafasi hii na ningeomba radhi niongee kwa lugha ya Kimombo kwa sababu tuko na wenzetu ambayo tukiendelea kuongea kwa Kiswahili wataona tumewatupa nje. Ni sawa? Good afternoon everybody. With the permission given by my fellow East Africans to just accommodate you and speak in English, because, you know, my keynote speaker really wanted to do his keynote in Kiswahili, but we have persuaded him to just, you know, accommodate the rest of you. Let me welcome you to what I promise is going to be a fantastic session. I'm always very nervous with afternoon sessions, especially when you are in a space where it's threatening to rain, and therefore the humidity is over. And even more so, when you have received the kind of amazing hospitality that the University of Dar es Salaam is well-deservedly renowned for. But I think the organizers of the program knew how to counter that by giving us the privilege of listening today from somebody whom I have no fear to stand on any platform and say is one of the foremost intellectuals that Africa has today. And I can say that actually not just Africa, but in the world. Now, that was a good thing they did. The mistake they made was to give a storyteller the privilege of introducing that person. So with all protocols deserved, I'm going to really hold myself back. I think if we manage our time well, I may be able to have the privilege that my brother Kamata had in being able to share lots of anecdotes. But I wanted to set the scene for the conversation we are having, just if you will grant me a minute or two, by saying that our keynote speaker, when you think about a colloquium on academic freedom, on democracy and sustainable development, is somebody who has worked in each one of those fields. Most of us are distinguished because we invest a lifetime of work in one of those three fields, the people who've been in this room today. But our keynote speaker has managed to do this and invest a lifetime of work and continues to do that in each of these three fields. I am setting him up because the last time we were together here at the University of Dar es Salaam, we began to ask him for a collection of his speeches because he said, I can't write my memoir right now. I've still got so much living to do. But his collection of speeches in itself, we felt was worth beginning, especially as early career, mid-career, as well as our seniors. I think all of us would have felt it would be worth us investing some time in looking at his thoughts over the years. So I'm using my platform to ask each of you in the break to push him, to put pressure on him, so that, there we've got the publication, so that we can leave here with one tangible publication. Okay, now there's a fight going on. This is great, because we were told intellectual spaces are about debate. My brother, I always call you Mwalimu because you're Mwalimu, Mgoya this morning said that the purpose of intellectual debate is not so that we can agree with each other, but it is to create a space where we can vibrantly and passionately engage the ideas. So, our keynote speaker, I'm still talking about him, is currently a distinguished professor at the Wits School of Governance. But before that, because we are talking about academia, and I know we have students in the room, he actually began his academic career when he received, as a student at the Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria, before going on to earn his doctorate at the University of Leeds. I wanted to mention the ABU in Zaria because the last time we were here, one of the things that Prof was very passionate about was paying tribute to the kind of debates we heard about in the morning and telling us about how, as a student at the time, all the way in Nigeria, they were receiving and benefiting from the intellectual production of the University of Dar es Salaam. So he comes back not only as a visiting intellectual, but really as somebody I think you can claim as one of your products. I also want to say that having done, as I said, he's done his time as a student, as a member of staff. He also has served in a range of institutions. I'm not going to read all of them, but it ranges everywhere from the African Union to providing intellectual leadership to a range of think tanks and on the boards of several institutions, such as the Development Policy Management, West African Civil Society Institute, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, Africa Governance Institute, Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, Nordic Africa Institute, South Center, Geneva. I could go on and on. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that having done the thinking, having engaged the theory, having done the teaching, he has also spent time actually practicing and seeing whether the thoughts he has hits the ground and what it looks like. My own favorite I was going to just put in is the Institute. When he was at the Institute for Economic Development and Philosophy, IDEP, I remember he gathered a group of us, and I want to pay tribute because Adebayo would bring a group of cultural actors. Most of us were musicians, we were directors of cultural centers, we were actors, and he put us together in conversation with policy actors from the Ministry of Planning. And I can tell you that was the most interesting exercise. But what I appreciated about what he did is he first brought us together as cultural actors. And after we had spent a few days saying everybody understands the importance of culture, he told us, no, now the next time I bring you, you must make the people who work as policy actors in the Ministry of Economic Development or development wherever they are in the continent understand and get the same passion so that you can translate your passion into real data, into real policy. I'm saying that to say that when he comes to talk to us about human rights, when he comes to talk to us about issues of academic freedom, democracy, and sustainable development, he comes with a solid grounding. And because I'm not the keynote speaker, let me just finish by saying that Adebayo Olukushi, our keynote speaker, has served as the Codestria Executive Secretary. I am very proud that when I joined Codestria 25 years ago, he is the one of those who welcomed me, who nurtured me, who continued to teach, and who continued to mentor. He is our current chair of the scientific committee, and it therefore gives me so much pleasure, so much joy to be able to welcome Professor Adebayo Olukushi.
Thank you very much indeed, Mshai, for this very artful setup. It's very difficult to escape the commitment which you have thrust on me to produce those collections of essays, and I will oblige eventually. I'm a child of Dar es Salaam in many ways, as you mentioned, of the University of Dar es Salaam, which I knew ever before I came to this country. The names of Isa, of Walter, of Mahmoud, of Nabudere, of Karim Hirji, name them, Walter Rodney, all those who are the animators and drivers of what came to be known as the Dar es Salaam School resonated in our classrooms as undergraduates at Ahmadu Bello University in the north of Nigeria. And there's a sense in which the radical school of Zaria considered itself actually to be a twin of the Dar es Salaam School, holding the flag of critical scholarship, engaged scholarship, high on the West African side of things. And in the midst of some of the crisis, would be an appropriate word, that came to hit the university system across the continent, I believe that my set was actually amongst those of undergraduates who benefited from some of the migrants from the Dar es Salaam school and came to Zaria, of the likes of Arnold Temu, of the likes of Bonaventure Swai, of Horace Campbell, just to name a few of them. And I think it spoke in a certain sense to a unity of purpose that was constructed around a shared vision of the emancipation of our continent. And although, as was alluded to this morning, there was probably a feeling of a Tower of Babel about the various perspectives that underpinned the debates that were going on. I can assure you, Comrade Walter, that we did not also have a shortage of people in Zaria whom we either nicknamed Koskiites, kulaks, social imperialists, and so on and so forth. Some of them classmates, others teachers, but depending on where people stood in the debates, those names also were reproduced on the campus of Ahmadu Bello University. In a certain sense also, I could almost move a motion to simply adopt the formulation of the impact of neoliberalism on rights, generally speaking, as presented to us by Issa earlier on. But I'm sure that simply moving that motion will not do for this afternoon. And so allow me to say that I take as my starting point where you almost concluded, which is that at least in our contemporary times, within our living memory, we have probably not witnessed an ideology and a policy frame that has been more damaging of humanity than neoliberalism. And its origins appeared to be very innocent when the conversations in the 1970s began to gather momentum about how to end what seemed to be the beginnings of the crisis of post-1945, post-war global economic development. You recall that in the period leading up to 1945, much rethinking was going on. And perhaps it was one of those periods when Karl Marx's Capital sold more copies than at the time it was published. But much thinking was going on against the backdrop of two wars, against the backdrop of a Great Depression, against the backdrop of the collapse of the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, about how to get the arrangement not only of domestic, social, and economic policy right, especially with a view to putting an end to the boom and bust cycle that obviously was now accepted as characterizing capitalism. Surprise, surprise, Karl Marx had of course written about this in Das Kapital, or formally mainstreamed into the conversation of the dominant classical economists and development thinkers of the time, but also at the global level on how to win the peace, to end the scourge of war in our times, as was proclaimed at the founding conference of the United Nations. And the main contribution that was acceptable within the framework of power at the time came from John Maynard Keynes, who not only had ideas about how the boom-bust cycle of capitalism that had become so ruinous could be more easily managed, but also how on a global scale, cooperation among nations in the economy, on trade issues, could also be better regulated as to ensure a sense of common and shared prosperity to underpin the quest for a stable framework for assuring the peace. And that became the origin of the Keynesian strand in classical economic theory. Keynes's idea centered around the important role of the state and the way in which the state, following the cycle of accumulation, could intervene so as to regulate periods of growth, but also manage periods of decline, particularly with a view to taming unemployment, which, as you might remember, was one of the biggest consequences of the Great Depression of the interwar years. Unemployment for John Maynard Keynes was therefore defined, at least in domestic public policy terms, as public enemy number one. And for Keynes, again, don't forget, he came out of a school of classical economics, which actually understood the interrelationship from the times of Ricardo and even Adam Smith, the relationship between politics and economics in the governance of societies. That he actually came to underscore that the one way in which you could secure the dignity of people was not only by creating what nowadays is referred to as a capable state, but also ensuring that unemployment was properly tamed. So that the goal, therefore, of public policy, the number one purpose of public policy, was employment generation and preservation. And that basically was the state of affairs until the 1970s, in which the state played an active and interventionist role in the economy. Let's leave aside the propaganda that was to come in the 1980s, that the problem of the African state was that it was interventionist. In fact, every state in the period from the 1940s, when the Keynesian revolution in economics and development thinking took place, was by definition an interventionist state. And the more successful states were those that were better able to manage public expenditures in ways in which, during periods of crisis, resources that came later on in the new millennium to be known as quantitative easing, and so on and so forth, will be pumped into the economy in order to ride out and create a counter-cyclical dynamic to keep economies going. By the 1970s, which, again, come to think of it in historical terms, in comparative terms, was probably the most prolonged run of growth that capitalism had known. A period from 1945 to the early 1970s, 1973, the OPEC oil price revolution of that year, was basically a period of massive growth in economies, and with it in living conditions. Living conditions that translated into not just per capita incomes increasing, but also national GDPs transforming, infrastructure investment taking place, inventions, technological inventions, what David Lance called Prometheus Unbound, the god of technology unleashed, as it were, to create a dynamic that was also underpinned by industrialization. Industrial capital with its long-term perspective, as opposed to financial capital with its very short-term speculative perspective. By the 1970s, this run of growth began to wane. And on its side came what in economics came to be referred to as a season of stagflation. Economies that were stagnating, inflation, price inflation that was rising. And it was in this context that the early attacks against the Keynesian economic model began to gain in currency, led by what, again, for those who are familiar with it, was referred to as the Chicago Boys. It was the Chicago School of Economics, an extremely right-wing school of economics. The dean earlier in the morning referred to the rise of quantitative social sciences. Actually, the first behavioral revolution in the social sciences was also going on around that time in the United States in the 1970s, when there suddenly emerged a methodological fascination with numbers and with quantification. Everything, including even love relationships, were to be measured in terms of figures and computed accordingly. Integration of nations, national unity, Karl Deutsch and others came up with frameworks of quantification, and the Chicago School became famed as a center that effectively broke from qualitative social science to promotion, was premised on a very strong ideological ground. And, you know, the Chicago Boys and their principal, their most eloquent spokesperson, a first-class honors person, clearly a very bright mind, took the view that actually it was wrong to assume that the enemy of public policy and therefore of social advancement generally was unemployment. Rather, public enemy number one was inflation. And what needed to be done was to tame inflation, including through the repression of public expenditures and also a dismantling of the interventionist role of the state in order to allow markets to fix prices and values. It was a very simple, attractive argument. The state had become too big. The state had become too interventionist. The state was watching over every move that we made. The ideological campaign against the state gathered momentum in a very direct way, to a point where I think, as Issa mentioned, by the end of the 1970s, we were no longer talking about the state as what we would nowadays call a collective public good, even in spite of all of the contestations of classes around it and within it. But rather, it came to be seen in the neoliberal vision as essentially an evil entity. And I'm using that word advisedly, an evil entity. Mrs. Thatcher actually did refer in one of her speeches to the evil state and the evils of interventionism and how you needed to get the state off the back of people so that people could just be allowed to be, let the market fix everything and sort out relations in society in that process. And it was exactly in that context, as the 1970s wore on, that we saw very strategic moves that were made by the neoliberals to basically conquer the heights of power. Beginning in the United States itself through the Treasury Department, a much underlooked department compared to the State Department, but actually an important powerhouse of economic policy making. And given the weight of the United States in the global economic system, with consequences for what would happen in the IMF and the World Bank, laying the foundation for what came to be known as the Washington Consensus, a consensus which was basically by neoliberal hawks that had captured the commanding heights of the Treasury Department and had infiltrated effectively the World Bank and the IMF to create a consensus that moved the neoliberal agenda away from the domestic onto the global scene. It was going to be unleashed on us in due course. and the conditions for doing so were maturing very rapidly on the African continent. But not before the Chicago boys had the opportunity to put into practice some of the ideas that they had developed on paper. And that opportunity came with the coup in 1973 against Salvador Allende. And guess who was the chief advisor to Augusto Pinochet, the general? I'm sure most people here know Augusto Pinochet. We talk a lot about Idi Amin and the like. Augusto Pinochet was on a deliberate project of promoting the tenets, the key principles of neoliberalism as part of a fight against socialism. Salvador Allende, whom he overthrew, being a socialist who was elected, and he driving an anti-socialist agenda with Milton Friedman, the best product of the Chicago school, the poster boy of the Chicago school, being his chief economic advisor. Relocated with sponsorship from the United States to Santiago de Chile and sitting by the side of Pinochet to undo Salvador Allende's socialism. And I don't think that one needs to stretch the definition of human rights in one direction or the other to understand that the Pinochet years were easily amongst the most brutal that humanity has seen in the 20th century, and perhaps even to date. The systematic attack that Pinochet was to launch using the military and the security services against all those who seemed to adhere to any idea of socialism, including even of a sense of community, was one which was launched simultaneously with the unleashing of market principles, of dismantling all forms of social welfare, of militarizing society, of turning the country essentially into one big prison against anybody who did not conform, and at the end of the day, basically eroding all imaginable rights, except the right to conform to what was on offer from that dictatorship. You remember also how that dictatorship ended after almost 2 decades of untrammeled domination of the political space. But it is basically my own long-winded way of saying that integral to the idea and the ideology of neoliberalism is actually an attack against the very notion and principle of humanity and of human rights. So, in a certain sense, and I will come back to that if the time permits, a political economy was to be spun in the course of the 1980s and 1990s to try to suggest a compatibility down the road, even if not immediately, between human rights and the neoliberal project as it began to play itself out on the continent. But with the practice that was gained and the experience that had been garnered in Chile during the Allende years, the neoliberal Chicago boys, having captured the Treasury Department, the World Bank, and the IMF, and enacted a Washington consensus, were ready to go global. And they were helped in this regard with the rise to power of the likes of Margaret Thatcher, of Helmut Kohl, of another right-winger in Canada who took over after Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, and Ronald Reagan in the White House at the time, effectively to also give political muscle to the project that was about to be launched. And that project came on the back of the African debt crisis, the external debt crisis that hit the continent in the course of the 70s, particularly after the Iranian Revolution, the second OPEC oil price revolution that saw the price of crude rising from under $10 to at one point $42 a barrel, in a context in which a great majority of the countries of the continent were themselves heavily dependent on importation of practically everything, including even raw materials for the import substitution industries. For the Tanzanians who are old enough to remember Walimu Shivji, Walter, and maybe as a student here also the Emeritus Chief Justice, you remember the shortages that immediately hit this country and many other African countries. Shortages of what we called essential commodities, of things like sugar, of milk, and the like, and of factories collapsing, of suddenly, as an editorialist was to put it in Zambia, suddenly, he said, it looks like everything around us is collapsing. That provided the exact condition that the neoliberals needed in order to move in. From the austerity measures which African governments proposed, in a manner as to reduce their public expenditures, balance their budgets, recalibrate their balance of payments, external trade, import and export balance sheet, but also preserve some of the social gains of independence, those gains that were so important to the making of citizenship, to the making of national identity, and to giving content and meaning to rights of the populace. We saw basically a rejection of those austerity measures as being too timid and too mild, and that all that was needed was precisely to embrace a structural adjustment program whose basic selling point and the slogan around which it was organized became getting prices right. Getting prices right. Now, let us contrast the reading of African scholars of the generation of Walimu Isa and others to the crisis that was unfolding. And there, in their interpretation, there was a clear understanding in the debates that the state had probably not lived up to the full expectation that independence imposed on it. But there was also, at the same time, no question of approaching the crisis of the 1970s into the early 80s by any other means than getting politics right. And the argument, therefore, which they made was that it was important, 2 decades after independence, for Africa to get politics right. Now, unpacking that in the debates that took place, Claude Ake, Tandika Mkandawire, Mahmoud Mamdani, generated different perspectives. But central, I want to argue, to the different positions was also the recognition that you needed to preserve the dignity of the African and find ways of enhancing that dignity even in the midst of crisis. Getting politics right became the slogan. There's a whole story that can be told about this, and it has been told by Tandika and Charles Soludo in the volume Our Continent, Our Future, which those who are interested might pursue further. But in complete contrast to that position, and even as institutions of the continent, such as the Economic Commission for Africa, were also making the case, remember the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, that one additional way of confronting the African crisis was to pursue regional integration much more seriously, and that Africa needed to overcome the disadvantages of fragmentation and the vulnerabilities to external shock by front-loading and accelerating the regional integration agenda, hence the Lagos Plan of Action, the World Bank and the IMF set up what they called the Berg Commission. And Elliot Berg was charged with understanding what has gone wrong. His conclusion, of course, was predictable. Africa, according to him, had lost the first 2 decades of independence. Those were wasted years of excessive state interventionism, and what was needed was to roll back the frontiers of the state and to unleash the forces of the market. And that marked Africa's entry into the neoliberal agenda full scale, with the conditionality clauses that effectively compelled country after country to embrace structural adjustment and to follow through with the various policies that were central to the adjustment framework. Now, those policies themselves had an immediate and direct impact on living conditions, right? We were students, and the first thing you woke up to, of course, was that you couldn't afford to eat 3 square meals a day anymore. So as students, you started adopting formulas. Depending on your circumstances, you could do 001, 001, you could do 010, you could do 00 half, depending on your circumstance. Scholarships disappeared, subsidies of campus food disappeared. The entire fabric of university life began to change. But what happened on campus was also refracted into society, right? It was the era of what Rauf Mustafa referred to as the multiple modes of livelihood, in which you were a university teacher by daytime, and at night you became, nowadays it's Uber, right? There was no Uber at the time. You became a part-time taxi driver, using your own car to run around the city across the night in order to earn an extra income in a dynamic of multiple modes of livelihood that in any case was unable to catch up with the inflationary pressures. So that we saw an effort effectively to re-engineer society away from its foundational principles that were so integral to the national liberation struggle of solidarity, of mobility, of social advancement, of a state that was anchored as much as possible in the broad aspirations for sovereignty of our countries. We saw effectively an erosion of all of those aspirations. And the response was almost spontaneous in country after country, from Cairo to Khartoum to places like Lusaka, the so-called IMF riots. Just Google it, and you will find how many articles were written on the so-called IMF riots. And I remember that each time there was going to be conversations between the military government in Nigeria and the IMF, and the information leaked. Students basically stopped classes for that day and took to the streets to say no to the IMF, no to the World Bank. These problems are ours. We will find a way to solve them internally, but without all of these agents of financial imperialism coming to dictate. And not a few governments were overthrown. Actually, the fall of Numeri in Sudan was on the back of the IMF riots that effectively mobilized the population when, in order to satisfy the international financial institutions, he allowed the price of bread to be raised, just as the IMF team were landing in Khartoum, and all hell broke loose. Gentlemen in suits who had very little experience of the history and context of Africa, we used to tease that they were basically people who just stepped out of economics classes in Harvard, taken into the World Bank, and told to dictate to finance ministers of our countries what policies they would be pursuing, regardless of the consequences. And if you did not adhere to those policies, you were accused of backsliding in a direction that did not seem to be favorable to what was thought to be good for you. Critics of the IMF and the World Bank across our continent were many. We felt the pinch. We knew what it meant in terms of political repression in order to implement even 1/10 of the prescriptions of the IMF and the World Bank, and what it meant in terms of turning lives and livelihoods upside down, 360 degrees upside down, to implement even 1/10 of them. An IMF, a World Bank chief economist for Africa at the time, Deepak Lal, was to say in an unguarded moment that was recorded and then reproduced in the International Herald Tribune, those measures are not easy measures. To implement them, you need effective, ruthless governments that can ride roughshod on public opinion. You need effective, ruthless governments that can ride roughshod on public opinion. Attacks on organized students, attacks on social movements, attacks on trade unions, attacks on everybody of conscience, what you would call again nowadays the public intellectuals, who would take a stand to say, can we slow it down a bit? Were all considered to be enemies of adjustment, and governments were under pressure with the pain of conditionality to ensure that they stuck to the script. And governments, on the other hand, tried to show their faithfulness to adjustment by violating every right, including the most liberal of those rights that were written either in the Constitution or in other texts. There was no alternative, as Mrs. Thatcher put it, to structural adjustment. And opposition to the programs was considered to be almost an act of treachery. Arrests of an arbitrary kind were very commonplace in the Africa of the 1980s and the 1990s. And yet, in spite of all of these, I think it's important also for us to understand that even in the midst of some of the so-called attempts at producing palliatives that will soften the effect of the neoliberal agenda, important changes in the dynamic of society were taking place. That individualization to which Issa referred earlier on in the day, of a hedonistic type of individualism, which was coupled with structural production of poverty. It was not just a question of poverty happening as a consequence of certain things, but actually a deliberate generation of poverty in order to feed a dynamic also of enriching a so-called new middle class that would be disciplined in the ways of the market and hopefully become the bearers of a new agenda of political reforms, to be distinguished from the middle class that was produced in the post-independence period or in the post-war period that essentially was seen as too state-based and too state-dependent. Your university professors, your nurses, your health workers, your medical doctors, those who ran and underwrote the activism and the ideas of citizenship of the first 2 decades of independence were considered to be passé, essentially, and a new middle class that was deliberately enriched through financialization, the privatization of state enterprises and the like, and effectively separated from the rest of the population in a twin dynamic of the mass production of poverty and an accelerated inequality on a scale which we have not seen on this continent, I would say, in living memory. And in that context, it is not surprising that what we have essentially witnessed insofar as the capacity of the bulk of the populace to not only exercise rights, but to demand them, and to defend them, even in the face of rogue governments, has effectively diminished over time. Insofar as social movements were dispersed, and again there was a deliberate political agenda of creating alternatives through NGIOization of social transactions in most of our countries, of the invention, deliberate by the World Bank and the IMF, of civil society that they wanted, including even trying to create their own Codesria-type institutions that they call think tanks, that will speak their language, and ultimately sending back their own clones, African clones, whom they had prepared properly to occupy our finance ministries and central banks. So that when Issa will get up and say that they are sending us young boys from Harvard in suits, Caucasian wasps, to come and dictate to us, a decade or so after, they were actually real Tanzanians who spoke better Swahili than Issa, and who were implementing the agenda of structural adjustment. And how are you going to engage them? Certainly not on the grounds that they were not Tanzanian or African enough. So we had an entire process in which effectively the disempowerment of the citizen was a central pillar of the agenda of neoliberalism. And in that process also, what some sociologists have described as the making of, in the context of mass immiserization, the making of essentially a complete group of déclassés, of people who basically were lost in the system, not even to be accounted for in any serious way. A commodification of everything. The late Chachage referred to it in one of his monographs as an era in which everything under the sky is for sale to the highest bidder. Everything is for sale to the highest bidder, including the state house, including your soul and body parts. A price was put on everything, and whoever could buy it would buy it, which produced its own dynamic of denationalization of our economies. Alongside that denationalization was also a crisis of national identity. And it is in the midst of all of these that Africa in the 1990s was ushered in, post-Berlin Wall, post-Soviet Union, end of history, as was referred to earlier on, to an age of democratization. A democratization that supposedly in the political economy of the Bretton Woods institutions was going to now, after successful recalibration of the state and its relationship with the society, of the remaking, if it was remade at all, of the social contract in the context of a watchman state, of a minimalist state, of a state that had been downsized or right-sized. The language of neoliberalism was massive. It was meant to neutralize political action. If you wanted to remove health subsidy, you didn't come out to say that you were removing health subsidy, because if you did that, there will still be some so stubborn remnants of dismantled social movements that will take to the streets and protest. You said that you are going to introduce user charges. User charges which by the time they are fully decoded would have meant already that you have implemented what you needed to implement. But essentially, all of that environment provided a context in which the so-called agenda of democratization of the 1990s was less about the re-empowerment of citizens and more about form over substance, ritual and procedures over true empowerment of citizens. And it did not take us more than a decade to begin to see through all of these. You hold elections on a 4-yearly basis. Sometimes you even elect opposition politicians into office and hope that it will be a new beginning for your country. Big mistake, because plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Indeed, the more it appeared to change, the worse it actually became. In most cases, opposition politicians, as well as ruling parties, regardless of who you elected, regardless of whatever they shared to you as a manifesto platform, implemented the same set of policies and did it worse than the previous administration that they succeeded. Corruption and all of the discontents associated with it, the criminalization of politics, the creation of plutocracies, and of new dynasties of power in a cocktail that effectively meant that our struggle to restore citizenship and therefore the natural rights that belong to us as human beings remain a forlorn hope for most of the peoples of this continent. And it is clear, I think, that unless we are able to win back, in the first instance, sovereignty over the policy levers of our countries, we are simply going to continue to move around in circles. And it is not so much because the world has not seen enough indicators to show the ruinous consequences of the neoliberal agenda. From the East Asian crisis of the late 1990s, 1996, 97, which led to the fall of Suharto in Indonesia. Mahathir was very smart. He survived it and was able to preserve some of the gains of post-independence Malaysia. Indonesia was not that lucky. Those who are presented to us as the best examples of what market liberalization could produce, suddenly finding themselves in a tailspin, to the repeated currency crisis that hit the countries of Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina to Brazil, even Chile itself, that was the home of the experimentation around neoliberalism. We saw crisis after crisis of people waking up in Argentina in the 1990s, having $1,000 equivalent in your account one morning, and the next day being told that what was in your account was not even worth a cent. And effectively, your money had simply evaporated. And of Brazil having to reinvent its national currency 2 or 3 times in the midst of the turbulence of the neoliberal economic agenda. Coming to Africa, where we also had our own share of the meltdown that came on top of the ruin that structural adjustment had left, and finally it going home to roost in the United States 2007, 2008, in the so-called subprime crisis. And if there's any lesson that those experiences should have taught us, it would be simply that the name of the game is simply do as I say, but not as I do. African countries were vilified in the name of printing money, excessive money, intervening. When the subprime crisis hit, we began to hear expressions like too big to fail, too big to fail. Institutions that were faced with bankruptcy were saved with taxpayer money. We had things like quantitative easing, which was basically printing money to keep the American financial system liquid, and of zero interest rate all of a sudden, in a context where in our own experiences of adjustment, we had interest rates going to sometimes 60% in the worst cases, effectively deindustrializing economies, creating the crisis of prolonged unemployment, including youth unemployment, of a process of chaotic, unplanned urbanization that turned most cities into slums, and within it, of people seeking in their best way possible to do a modicum, or enjoy a modicum of citizen rights in a context of a state that had effectively abdicated all of its responsibilities. Winning back sovereignty on the levels of economic policy would be one of the most important steps we would need to take in order to win back rights. And there are debates on what we might do. 55 African countries, counting Western Sahara, collective sovereignty ideas are being debated, ways in which we could, of course, accelerate integration back on the agenda. Some of the ideas that Kwame Nkrumah and others attempted to push at independence and which sounded heretical, even to the point of being dismissed as communistic, have come to the mainstream, but not exactly on terms which we are choosing, not exactly in terms of the political and ideological framing of the Pan-Africanism of the early post-independence years, but in a manner that seeks to discipline our collective aspiration to the ideas and the ideals of a neoliberal agenda. And breaking that link between neoliberalism and policymaking can only happen if we reclaim sovereignty over our domestic political and policy spaces. And in that process, I hope that the references that have been made here to the revival, having come this far and faced with the specter of a wholesale destruction of our planet, not only in environmental terms, but also with regard to the threat of a nuclear Armageddon, of a diminishing Western bloc and its NATO armed wing, refusing to decline peacefully, not accepting the idea that they could ever become an equal or same level player as other actors in the international system. I hope that we will be able to gather ourselves together and rebuild a basis for our Pan-Africanism, because after all, as Samir Amin said, it's a matter of survival. The survival of the human race, and within it, the survival of the African, in a manner that will enable us to rebuild dignity that has eluded us for way too long, and effectively give content and meaning to the rights and aspirations that, after all, underpinned the struggle for independence. I'll stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Adebayo. I think you will agree with me. Did I make up what I said earlier on? No, right? And I think for a keynote that's supposed to just get us to start to think, we've begun to see how all the threads that we began with in this morning, the stories we were telling, the anecdotes, the discourses that were happening in the 60s and 70s, we're coming full circle. But as Bayo says, even as we think about how we reclaim our sovereignty, how we rethink Pan-Africanism, how we make sure that our human dignity is actually respected, not just in the way that neoliberal human rights, as we discussed in the morning, has defined it, but in the way that we go back to the foundations. Words like Utu begin to have real meaning in the way that we want to live it. I'm looking at Ndugu Kamata. I don't know if we have time for a comment or two. Yes, and then we'll just take up maybe one round of questions, thoughts. I know there's a lot that has been said, but something that's at the top of your mind that you just want to put out into the room. It's always difficult after a keynote like that, right? You're thinking, and there's so much going on. But any quick thoughts? Yes, I see one hand at the back. Let me just see a couple, and then I'll take one here. Any from this side, and then we'll call it just those three. Okay, so we'll take those three. Please make it short, because we have a fantastic panel coming after us, and I know we'll continue to think through these ideas as we go on. Tafadhali Kaka at the back.
Yes, thank you, Prof. That was fantastic and quite enlightening. So just a small question. In the efforts to arrive at the sovereignty in terms of policy, and probably in our case, knowledge sovereignty, I'm just curious, where do we place the role of leadership in the question of that particular struggle? What is the role of leadership in the question of that struggle if we are to arrive as winners in this particular battle? Thank you.
Thank you. The role of leadership, by which I think he means political leadership. It was coming here.
Thank you, Prof. It was quite interesting and illuminating following your discussion and your keynote. I have about 2 questions and just 1 comment. The first comment being that where you mentioned that the beginning of neocolonialism appears to be innocent, but don't you think it was intentional based on what took place during the Bretton Woods Conference and looking at the aftermath of the Second World War that ushered us into the Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations, and when you see what is happening in terms of the violations of human rights. Then number 2 is what is the role of technology related to the issue of leadership? What is the role of technology in this, and particularly the promotion, as well as the promotion, protection, as well as the violation of human rights? Then the other question is, don't you think we are also good at squandering opportunities? Based on what transpired during the new international economic order, where African leaders had the chance to stage their demands and really press very clearing demands to the Western world. And of course, the fact that what we see in the neo-colonial era, the players are the only ones that changed, but the mission and the business remained as usual. I remember the comment by the CJ Emeritus, where he said the candidate lost because he thought the British had left. But don't we see them in a different garment? And I think that was very hilarious. And maybe to raise some few small...
I'm afraid we do not have the time. Can I just take those ones, please?
Oh,
so the
okay.
role of leadership again, technology, we're going to the third person was there, and then I will allow one last one here. There's a third person there.
Which one?
The hand has gone down. I don't know whose hand was. It was somewhere in the middle. Oh, it was there, behind.
Thank you very much, Professor Adebayo, for an excellent presentation. I'm Professor Mwakigonja from MOHAS. I have maybe one or two comments or comments, if I can say so. One is the role of Mwalimu Nyerere and Nyerereism in this. We remember that maybe one of the factors which led to Mwalimu stepping down was refusal to take the structural adjustment programs. And also, he was a staunch advocate of actually an opponent of loans. He wanted them to give us more of trade, to promote trade between the North and the South, instead of loans and things like that. And then the South-South cooperation. And what's the role of South-South cooperation, as it was advocated by people like Nyerere in taking Africans out of this? And also, most of it is, we are talking about it mostly from the point of colonialism. But what is the role of pre-colonialism era? For example, the slave trade, which took a lot of slaves from Africa. Most of these were able-bodied men and women, probably who were also brain-wise, the most sound. So actually there was a lot of brain drain during the slave trade, including the most physically able people who went to the developed countries. So they contributed to develop those countries, and it contributed to loss of economy on the part of Africa. But are we still also suffering from probably lack of the best, which left during the slave trade? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're extending now the thinking to the global, both in terms of time and geography. And the last question over here, my sister here. Yeah. And I'm not sure if Bayo will respond to all of this in detail, but I will give you an opportunity to say something.
Good afternoon, Prof. Thank you so much for a profound presentation. My question is about globalization. When you were ending, you said that we need to reclaim our sovereignty. What is the place of globalization in neoliberalism while we are trying to reclaim our sovereignty?
Thank you. Professor Olukushi.
I'll be quick that way. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, colleagues, for these observations. And I'm sure that the panel that is coming next will probably address some of these issues. You know, this business of globalization, pretty much like human rights, it's an ideology. It's an ideology of domination that was foisted on us. At a point, the narrative was essentially that part of our problem was that we were not globalized enough. And some of us got so excited that you'll meet a Nigerian or a Tanzanian or a Kenyan, and you say, so how are you? Where are you from? Say, I'm a global citizen. And you just feel sorry for that person. Because the weight that is associated with those notions did not really unfold themselves to us sufficiently until recently. The same people who are the apostles of globalization are the leading practitioners of protectionism today. So much so that there is a literature that is developing around what is called de-globalization, rolling back. And the political manifestation of that, Donald Trump. America first. Even regions of the world like Sweden that used to be bastions of solidarity have now elected right-wing political parties that are saying Sweden first. Okay? So my message essentially is that globalization begins at home. You don't enter into an arena in which you are weak and you pull your shirt and say that you are ready to enter into combat. Nobody ever globalized without being strong first at home. When you have gained in strength and confidence at home, you tell your neighbor, globalize. That was Adam Smith's thesis of free trade, right? Yeah. When you are strong enough, you have things to trade, you tell your neighbor, let's do free trade. Only that you'll be supplying me the raw material and stay at the bottom of the value chain, and I will bring you the processed commodities. And I think all of this speaks to the central importance which we should attach to leadership. Leadership does matter in almost every endeavor, but not in a narrow sense in which you simply look at one figure at the top of a political ladder and say that, well, leadership matters because I'm looking at Ruto or I'm looking at Tinubu or the like. You could actually have some fairly ineffective people, let me be very diplomatic, at the top of that ladder. But you have a leadership complex in social movements. And that is why it is important that things like academic freedom, things like the right to organize, the right to speak, the right to engage become important, because they are important ingredients in mobilizing leadership. So we need to move away from a mystified notion of leadership, as though it was an attribute exclusively monopolized by one or a group of people, to understanding leadership in a dynamic sense, in which there is a contestation of ideas on how to better society or how to resist those who want to undermine societal progress. Well, technology, I think we're also beginning to learn that it is not necessarily the magical bullet and panacea for everything. In one of my previous lives as International IDEA, the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, I had occasion, Joe Luca organized us once, in which people invested themselves heavily in election technology. Opposition leaders. I remember Lipumba here and others saying, no, we need technology. I say, okay, fine. But is it technology that will deliver free elections for you? Or is it something else plus technology that will give you free elections? If you do not have engaged and active citizens, if you do not have empowered citizens, you can bring all the technology in the world into your political process. It will not make any difference. And when I start reading about Venezuelans in Kenya, NASA people in Ghana, a certain Mr. Anokoye, in Nigeria, the Supreme Court ruled last week that you can buy all the technology. If the Election Commission likes it, can use it. If it doesn't like it, can drop it. It has the right to determine what it wants to do with your technology. And these are expensive investments. And I think, essentially, let us not understand technology outside of politics. It is politics that disciplines technology to the attainment of desired social and political objectives. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Olukushi for giving us so much to think about. I think with no other due ceremony, it is my pleasure, Ndukamata, to invite the chair of the next session. This is wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
Habari ya saizi. Sasa mimi ni mshairi. Napenda sanaa ya ushairi na nilikuwa nimeandaa mashairi mawili. Sasa sijui kama kwa ajili ya muda bado ninaruhusiwa kuyafanya yote mawili. Daktari Kamata, naruhusiwa kufanya yote mawili au nafanya moja? Naam. Naam. Sawa. So, I would start one I would do it on the podium, and another one I would do it outside the podium. My name is Jasper Kido, and I'm a poet. I'm a spoken word poet, and my first poem is called Redemption Prose. Redemption Prose. I paraphrase Redemption Song by Bob Marley. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves shall free our minds. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. For ignorance is our enemy. So think deep, think positively, critically, read between the lines, ignore the lies, and let's wear the self-reliant AIDS-proof as financially. The burden of debts is killing us softly. Poof, economically. You're still colonies of the West with your dependent economies. Look at us. That to welcome the Sadas to invest in the land as we fail to mobilize internally, seriously. I beg to differ in this fact, and this is my ideology. Change and development is brought by men and women who live within the borders. And if it was my order, I would have chased away all the brothers and sisters with a hidden agenda. Talker! I'm fed up with this politricks of poverty and politics, making the political lives be of two halves. The haves and the have most. The have not and part of the have life, or the other dying already dead rot, 6 foot underground. May God rest their soul. I'll see you later. I'll see you soon when I get there. Peace. So that is my first poem. A disclaimer to my second poem. Yes. Okay, so this is a bit technological. Uko Gaza ni unyama tu watawala, mauaji ya kimbari na ukatili wa kila aina. Haujanza jana, jifunze historia. Amka kijana, simama na Palestina. Amka we mama, simama na Palestina. Wajawazito na watoto wauliwa, wakina baba hawana pa kulala. Kata ujinga na hada zisizo maana. Israeli si taifa bali laana. Amka kijana, simama na Palestina. Amka we profesa, simama na Palestina. You have the right to remain silent. Mr. Miss Geologist, yes you who knows all about the rocks, you who knows much about the texture and the composition of the soil, you who are fascinated by the structure of the mountains and valleys, and at the same time are thrilled by the composition of the craters and its depth. Yes, you who knows all there is to know about the history, the art, the science of Mother Earth, and you who are so informed of its outmost top to its innermost underlying surface. Yes, you who have opted to auction your knowing, your skills and expertise to the Anglo-Sophoth mining conglomerates and the likes. You who have found it fit to remain in the sidelines as the small miners, the artisans, are being humiliated and are facing evictions. Yes, you surely have the right to remain silent, for all the constraints facing the downtrodden masses is none of your business, since they are not your clients. Miss Journalist, you have the right to attend the press conference and eventually become the state's mouthpiece as you publish its press release. You have the right to fall into the bandwagon and also become a victim of trend and nonsense news. You sure do have the right to remain neutral and not choose sides. You have the right not to question who sets the neutrality standards then. You have the right to be an agent of CNN, BBC, DW, Sky News, Reuters, and condemn Hamas for provoking the Israelites. But you also have the right to do a bit of research and consultation and trace about the Nakba and the Balfour Declaration. You have the right to cover and expose the so-called mess and the uncouth life and trade of the street vendors, the marchingers. At the same time, you have the right not to document on the land grabbing happening in Barari, Ngorongoro, and Kilosa. Dear member of media, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to remain silent, for you do not want to provoke the sleeping giant to only revoke your license. You don't want to experience the pangs of self-inflicted hunger and poverty. You have the right to remain silent and to only protect your stomachs and the welfare of your loved ones. You have the right to remain silent and not to publish the facts negatively implicating the authority. You have the right to remain silent and not to tell the truth, for the truth is nothing but a myth, as the truth shall not set you free, but shall instead and indeed hold you a captive. You have a right to remain silent. Miss Advocate. Yes, you You, the learned brother and sister, the so-called pioneers of peace, the combatant of disorder and anarchy through your enacted awful legislations. You, the drafters of contracts, the bilaterals and multilaterals that tend to despise and undermine our sovereignty. Remember EPA and Bandari? You have the right to remain silent. You, the officers of the court who ought to stand for justice but ought not to, as you decide to do the otherwise. And that's to side with the corrupt and the ill minds and to justify and legalize their illegal acts through your well-thought submissions. And the same is echoed and embraced in the judgments of the honorable lords and ladies of justice and peace. Yes, you, of the world's noblest profession, you too have the right to remain silent. For silence, even though it's detrimental to the mass, to you it is indeed very much lawful and blissful, to say the least. To the kings and queens of the theories, the sociologists, the political scientists, the social scientists, the fathers and mothers of humanity, you who are so invested in understanding and defining our communities, you who find pleasure in analyzing, debating, and contextualizing on the social relations of our life realities, you who are so fond of donor-funded researchers and consultancies, you who are said to be the mastermind of our national strategies and policies, you who find pride in exhibiting our life-threatening and deadly experiences in your soul books and journals, in your symposiums, and in your intellectual podiums. You who find heaven in your classrooms to only lecture about our atrocities with no agitation, you too have the right to remain silent and not to join us in the streets as we protest on the shooting prices and the growing rates of death caused by inequalities. You too have the right to remain silent, for your intellectual work is more than enough. It is so comforting, pleasing, and peaceful. It is so complete as it offers a blend of theory and practice. Its praxis. You sure have the right to remain silent, or the state and your Western sponsors would silence your pockets, and so would they silence your lavish living privileges. You have the right to remain silent, dear members of the academia, for in silence there is assurance to continue to enjoy your petty bourgeois tendencies. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to remain silent. But I don't. Thank you.
And the exploiters, or an organic intellectual of the masses struggling for their emancipation. It's tea time. We break for 10 minutes as we process this moving keynote speech and the moving poem. Okay. Thank you very much.